Hello, some of you have asked about how to warp your new Loom To Go. To do this, you'll need blue tape. I've got a few pieces of regular printer paper. I've trimmed them to 7.5 inches wide. You can choose whatever width you want as long as it's wider than your intended weaving width. You'll need your loom and a heddle. I've chosen the 8-dent heddle. It is labeled in the corners up here and up here. You'll need something to cut your yarn with. I'm using some inexpensive snips that I got. You'll need a measuring device. I've got a simple little measurer there. You'll need the clamp that came with your loom. And you'll need the warping peg that also came with your loom. I'll show you how to assemble it in a moment. And of course, yarn. I'm using this, it's a worsted weight wool. Now that we've got everything gathered that we need, let's go ahead and start warping. First thing I'm going to do is take my heddle out. I've decided I want a 6-inch warp so I can make something 6 inches wide. You'll notice your heddle is marked in the middle. That tells you exactly where the center line is. I'm going to take a couple pieces of tape and I'm going to measure out my 6 inches. I'm going to line up 3 inches with that center line and I'm going to put a piece of tape at the 6-inch mark. In this case, I'm going to cover the slot after that. I'll do the same at the 0-inch mark, but I'm going to leave that slot open and just cover the hole next to it. And I'll put that back where it goes. Now that I've marked my heddle, I'm going to start warping. I'm going to clamp the loom down to this side of the table here. You'll need your clamp for this. Push this button behind the handle to release it, and then you'll want to line it up so that the clamp sits on that bump on the bottom of the cross brace. The first thing I need to do to make sure I've got the right length is measure. I'm going to pull this up and I'm going to measure from that to the length of the warp that I want. In my case, I'm going to warp 45 inches. That'll allow a little bit of wastage, some fringe, and then about a 30 or so inch weave. Once I've measured that, I'll take my scissors and place them at that distance. So from here, out here, 45 inches, I'm placing my scissors there to hold the place. You're going to need to assemble your peg. It will come in its bag. It'll have a peg, a clamping block, a bent screw, a washer, and a wing nut. You're going to be putting the bent part of the screw through your peg and clamping it to the bottom of your table with the block. So I'm going to start by putting the threaded part through the block and threading on my washer and then my wing nut. Then I'll clamp it on like this, pull that up to the bottom of my table and tighten it up. Now that you've got your peg set up and your loom lined up with it, you'll want to put your yarn on. I'm going to place my yarn on the floor behind it and then pull this apron rod back. Just line up the thread with where it's going to be on here. See where that is relative to the string. And then just tie it on with a simple square knot. And I have this set up and tightened out of the way so the pawl is not falling onto the crank. So after that, you're going to need one more part that I didn't tell you about. You'll use the reed hook, which I forgot to mention, but is also included in your kit, and feed it through that first slot and pull a loop from your yarn ball through it and all the way to your warping peg and just place it over the warping peg. This will give you a good chance to straighten things out, make sure it's lined up. After that, you'll pull this under and you're going to alternate between over and under the apron rod, and you go to the next slot, pull that. Since I just went under, I'm just going to pull this over, go to the next slot, pull that through. The warping peg sets the length of your warp, and holds it while you're working on this step. This is a direct warp because you're tying directly to the apron rods. I just went over, so I'm going under to the next slot, pulling it through, and then you do this all the way to the end where you put the blue tape before. Now you can see that I'm getting close to the middle as it's marked on the heddle. So my next spot will be on the other side of the center mark. I'm going to skip over the middle string on the apron and start my next loop on the other side of it, basically just to keep things centered nicely. Okay. I've gotten towards the end, and this is the last slot I've got open before I hit my tape. So I'm going to go ahead and pull it through, just like the previous ones. These are all warp threads. And then I'm going to cut my thread and tie it on. Just there. I'm going to cut that a little shorter. Doesn't need to be quite that long. I'll do the same to the other end. That was all with the wide end. The next step is going to use, the next threading step will use the small end. But first we're going to crank it on to the rear axle. I've got all of my stuff set. I'm going to pull this right off the top of this. And I'm going to keep that loop safe by holding on to it or putting tape in it or tying a piece of string on it. Then I'm going to loosen the pawl on the rear and hold this relatively tense and start cranking it back. I loosened the pawl so it would fall and keep it from turning back the other way. Keep this snug. You don't have to pull it really hard. You're just trying to keep all of the warp threads kind of straight. Now that this is about to loop over on itself, I'm going to set this down with those loops preserved and grab a piece of paper and place it underneath the warp. I'm going to let it go over itself a little bit because that gives me a place to tuck this, okay? You want it to be fairly straight so that it stays underneath all of your work. Now you can see it's on there, it's fairly straight, and what it's doing is keeping each layer from tangling up with the one underneath it. You can see I'm running to the end of this piece of paper. Grab another piece of paper, and then you can wind it on, just like before. I'm keeping these loops preserved. Now I'm going to use another piece of paper. My warp isn't really long enough to need the entire piece, but I need part of it, so I'm gonna go ahead and add that. And now that I've gotten to about this front bar, I can go ahead and cut these, but I think I'm actually going to give myself just a little more thread. I'll loosen this pawl, pull it back a little. So you can see it's all the way at the bar. You've got a couple inches past the apron rod. Now that I'm there, a lot of people will tie these in groups, but because this is such a narrow warp, I'm going to just cut it. It goes to the exact same length. What I'm going to do is remove the tape. We've done all of our threading, all of our initial warps, so I don't need the tape anymore. Now I'm going to take the skinny end of the threading hook, and I'm going to start on the left from the front. And I'm just going to go along and move one of the two threads into the hole next to it, while keeping the other one in the slot. I'll just lay them to the side as I go. There we go. If you separate them in the slots a little bit, it does make it a bit easier. And I go all the way to the end. You'll end up with your last one in a hole right there, and you'll have your full weaving width. I'll catch up with you when I get to the end. Here's the last one. And I'll thread this one through this slot. To tie on, I like to start in the middle, which is, again, handily marked. You can just choose which side the hole goes on, that center hole. And then I just take 4 and 4 threads because that is an inch width. I'm going to take that, I'm going to split it over that middle string on the apron, which I have aligned so that it's centered on here and won't hit it when it wraps around. I'm going to place each half of that on either side of that, and then I'm just going to tie them with a double twist. That's one twist, and then I just put it through there again instead of a normal single twist knot. That's it. And I pull those so they're fairly snug. You're going to have ends sticking out, and that's it. Now I'm just going to alternate sides and go back and forth to try to keep the tension approximately the same. And I'm doing 2 clusters of 4 threads all the way. When I get to the ends, the numbers won't work. I'll just try to divide what's left approximately evenly. So I, again, take one half and go under and go to the right, the other half to the left, and then twist this through twice. There's a reason I do that, and that's because it makes it easier to adjust the tension later before we start winding on. That was the left, so I'll take the right. And warping is really the most tedious part. Once you're warped up, it's really easy to get weaving. Now this last little bit looks like 5 on this side, and I'm 4 on this side. So I'll go ahead, and these are approximately in line, but still a little inside these threads. So I'm going to stay inside this apron string. And I'm doing 1 bundle of 3 and 1 bundle of 2. Now I've got all this tied on. I can wind it forward a little bit after I loosen my pawl and rest it on my crank. I'm adding a little tension. And I'm going to actually advance the loom a little bit so I have more length to work with here. Not a huge amount of tension, just enough to feel what you're doing. You can go across now and press and see which ones feel a little looser. For me, that's this one. So I'm going to find those threads, those little handles I made with those knots, and now I can pull up and tighten. And that just tightened the tension on that. This one's tighter, so some of these are going to feel looser, like this one. And it's just a little pull up and tighten, because that pulls it tighter. This one's pretty good. This one could use just a little more. Pull forward, and that means this one. Pull forward, and there. And you can also push to loosen a little if you have to. That's fairly even. So now the whole thing is warped and it's ready for you to start weaving. You can trim these a little if you want. I'm going to, just because it's less thread wrapped onto the front beam. So I will go ahead and trim these a little bit while leaving some handles so they don't unravel. And then I'll come back and I'll show you how to start weaving.